Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are letting folks in from the waiting room right now. People will be rolling in. I just want to make sure everybody is in the meeting before we get started. We want to thank everybody for joining us this very hot Monday morning. We're really excited to have such a great, distinguished panel here to talk about the court, and we'll be getting started any second. Congressman Jamie Raskin will be joining us momentarily. We're having a couple of technical issues, but we're very excited to get him in here and to discuss the 2023-24 court term with so many great experts. So we'll go ahead and get started now while we wait for the congressman to join us. But before we do get started, my name is Joe Van Wy. I'm a senior legislative strategist here at P Street, the government affairs sister organization of the Progressive Change Campaign Committee. And we are so thrilled to have Congressman Jamie Raskin back with us, along with a group of leading court reform experts and advocates for today's timely event to discuss the current Supreme Court term and the court's growing legitimacy crisis. I know everyone is eager to hear Congressman Raskin and our brilliant guests, but before we begin, I'm going to go over a few short housekeeping notes. First of all, remember that today's briefing is interactive. If you're comfortable doing so, we'd love to have folks turn on their cameras so we can see the amazing crowd that we have with us today. To all our PCCC members, to ask our guests a question, please send it in the Zoom chat with your hometown and your state. To members of the press, please include your name and your outlet when you ask a question, but please feel free to just throw it in the Zoom chat. You can view the chat by clicking the button with the dialogue icon at the bottom of your screen. If your question is selected, including all of you who submitted questions on our RSVP page, and thank you for sending those ahead of time, Aaron with our team will message you to make sure that you're ready to ask your question live. Then we'll unmute you and call on you during the Q&A portion. We won't call on you unless you reply to Aaron's direct message, so remember to keep an eye out for that in the chat area if you still want to ask your question. For all of you joining via Facebook today, you can also ask questions by commenting on the Facebook live stream, and we'll read some of those out loud. To everyone watching today, whether on Zoom or on Facebook, please feel free to put a question in the chat at any time, but please keep them between 10 and 20 seconds so we can get through as many as possible. And lastly, just so everyone is aware, today's meeting or discussion is being recorded. So keep that in mind as we go forward. Now, over here at P Street and PCCC, we have a bit of a tradition. Today, we're going to unmute everybody on the call for just a few seconds so you can give a big, warm hello to all of our guests, Congressman Raskin, Joyce, Vance, Dahlia, Lithwick, and Lauren Windsor, as well as to all the progressives with you in the audience here today. So on the count of three, let's all say hi to one another, give a cheer, and turn up that energy. 1, 2, 3.
Hey, everybody.
Hey, morning.
Three cheers.
Vote blue.
Thank you for being here.
Amazing. Thank you, everyone, for that enthusiastic start to today's event. Now, I'm going to turn the floor over to Adam Green. He is the co-founder of the... Sorry, it appears that I was muted there for a second. We're going to turn the floor over to Adam Green, co-founder of the Progressive Change Campaign Committee, P Street sister organization, to set the stage for our conversation today. Adam?
Great. Thanks so much, Joe, and to the whole P Street and Progressive Change team. And hello to everybody. Welcome to our now annual Jamie Raskin Love Fest. As you can imagine, Jamie Raskin is one of our most popular heroes in Congress. And our Zooms with him typically get hundreds of attendees live and then 50 to 100,000 views online when posted on social media. Those watching live get to ask questions. So congrats to the hundreds of folks on right now and joining by the minute. Today is the 2-year anniversary of the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe versus Wade. And we come together during an absolutely pivotal week in 2024 with a presidential debate this Thursday that could determine the future of the court, and over a dozen decisions left to be decided in the next week that could fundamentally reshape whether presidents are above the law, whether people who need them can get an abortion, and whether government agencies can actually do their jobs and improve people's lives. Sadly, these decisions are being decided under a troubling circumstance. This right-wing Supreme Court is corrupt, political, and facing a legitimacy crisis. With regular exposés about bribes to Clarence Thomas and Sam Alito's multiple homes flying an insurrectionist flag, the corruption and illegitimacy of this court is more profound than ever. Members of Congress are debating legislation to force the Supreme Court to live by binding ethical standards. And Americans will soon decide whether to put back in the White House Donald Trump, the convicted felon who publicly bragged about appointing justices who overturned Roe versus Wade and have taken a political wrecking ball to so many norms in our American way of life, hurting workers, helping big corporations, hurting families, and undermining democracy. There's no better group to discuss all of this with than Congressman Jamie Raskin and legal experts Joyce, Vance, and Dahlia Lithwick. We'll also hear from activist filmmaker from the Undercurrent, Lauren Windsor, who recently caught Sam Alito on tape, admitting his political intentions. So first, let me just see if Jamie is on yet. Joe, do we have a congressman?
I just heard from his team. They're still having a couple of technical difficulties, but they are working on getting him on just as soon as possible.
Okay, so we'll have a pre-question to our two legal experts, Joyce Vance and Dahlia Lithwick. You know, we're 2/3 of the way through this term. Can you tell us a little bit about your observations so far on what cases have been decided, what cases are around the corner, and what they all collectively mean to the legitimacy of this court? Dahlia, would you like to start with that one?
Sure. And it's so good to be with all of you. Thank you, Adam. And thank you, Joe. And it's always great to be with Lauren and with Joyce and with the congressman. I think that what I would say is that I've never in my career, which is 25 years of being a journalist covering the court, seen a term like this one insofar as we have at least nominally till the end of this week to get to the end of the term. And there are still, by my count, 14 cases, if you count the consolidated cases separately, sort of any 3 or 4 of which would be blockbusters in any other term. So this is a term in which the court has, in every sense of the word, bitten off more than it can chew. And in so doing, has slow walked really essential cases like the Trump immunity case. I think the other thing I just want to say as a kind of table setting point is that it is going to be really tempting when you start to see the numbers at the end of the term that suggest that, well, mifepristone didn't go badly, and Rahimi, the gun case that would disarm domestic abusers, didn't go badly, and Moore, the tax case that would have blown up the tax code as we know it, didn't go badly. And the lesson to derive from that is that we have a really moderate court. That's like I think the fashionable term is it's a 3-3-3 court with 3 intense moderates at the center, and no part of that is true. And I just want to say part of the reason that the court is issuing what seems like sane and reasoned opinions in the mifepristone case and in Rahimi, the gun case, and in Moore, the tax case, and in several really urgent cases isn't because this is a moderate court. It's because the court has so much going on that on a few cases, a few justices have modulated. And more urgently, almost all of those cases come from a renegade Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals that got way out in front of its skis and tried to overturn things from below. And so what the court is doing in a lot of the cases that appear to be the court acting sanely is just error correction, either of Fifth Circuit or overreach or error correction, as we saw last week in Rahimi, of its own overreach in the Second Amendment case, Bruin, from 2 terms ago. So I just want to sort of start by saying please, please, please don't let the nose counting and the vote counting and the narrative about how intensely moderate this court is and how Brett Kavanaugh, as the median justice, has become a liberal. Please, please don't be fooled by those kinds of claims that you may hear from some mainstream corporate press at the end of the term. And I think I'll turn it to Joyce to amplify whatever I missed.
Well, like always, you missed absolutely nothing. And I want to join Dahlia in thanking all of you for being with us and letting you know how honored I am to have the chance to share a few thoughts with you this morning. I'll be brief because I see the congressman has joined us, but I do want to make this point. I'm a former federal prosecutor, a former U.S. attorney. I spent 25 years at DOJ, and before I became a political appointee, I spent a lot of time as the chief of the appellate division in my office. I was in Alabama, the 11th Circuit. Many of you will remember that the 5th Circuit used to be much larger than it was until I forget the exact year, 1987 is what I want to say. The circuits were split, creating the 5th and the 11th. And I think Dahlia is dead on the money when she talks about the 5th Circuit's urge to reverse longstanding precedent from below, which is, by the way, nothing new in my part of the country, and something that we should all be alert to. Because of my professional background, I am hardwired to respect federal judges. And I can't tell you how painful this term of court has been purely from that perspective of learning that much of what we feared, the worst of what we feared about what's animating some of these justices' decisions, actually understated the real problems. This ProPublica reporting on outright corruption, these recent disclosures, and look, it's no surprise, right, when you hear Sam Alito talking about bias, because we've all read his speech from a couple summers ago in Rome, where he pretty much said the same sort of thing, saying the quiet part out loud. I think increasingly the question is, what are we going to do about it? Because we are living through a term where Donald Trump's criminality, cases that we're waiting on still for decision, have obscured some of the really important constitutional issues our country faces. Like, what's the future of the administrative state in this country? What sort of power will our executive agencies have to make all of our lives better? We're clearly in a moment where something here needs to be right-sized. And so it's great to be with y'all today to have a part of that conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joyce. And thank you to the now almost 200 folks who are here. Welcome, Congressman Raskin. I'm going to ask you a question in a second. And for those who have questions in their mind, just a reminder to post your question in the chat with your name and hometown, and then keep looking at the chat so we can unmute you and have you ask your question. So, Congressman, they say that justice delayed is justice denied, and we are thrilled to no longer be denied your presence amidst the delays on this call. Thank you for joining us. And I want to ask you a question about the immunity case that will get decided just within the next few days. And that's that with Americans worried about this court's corruption and the increasing legitimacy crisis facing this court, what do you see as the stakes for this court's legacy and their confidence level with the American public when it comes to the Donald Trump immunity case that's just around the corner? Congressman?
Well, thanks, Adam, for having me. Other than Chief Justice Roberts, perhaps, I don't know that any of the right-wingers on the court really care about their legacy. I mean, they're basically acting like, just mega Republicans on a town council somewhere. And they are working to try to see that their team is going to win. They have already substantially, and let's hope not irrevocably, intervened in the 2024 presidential campaign. And of course, this goes all the way back, really to Bush versus Gore, when the Supreme Court intervened for the first time in a presidential election to stop the counting of ballots and to hand the victory to the popular vote loser, in that case, George W. Bush. But it certainly goes back also to Shelby County versus Holder, the dismantling of the Voting Rights Act, the pre-clearance mechanism, the coverage formula that was in Section 4. And that then opened the door for a whole series of voter suppression tactics across the country, and the placement of new obstacles to registration and to voting, the shutting down of hundreds of precinct polling places, disproportionate closure in minority areas, and so on. And then in this election, the Supreme Court plucking up from the DC Circuit a unanimous, bipartisan, perfectly valid, airtight, analytically decision on presidential immunity, and then to hold it for month after month after month, in order to slow down the possibility of Jack Smith's prosecution of Donald Trump. So, we're already looking at a legacy right now, Adam, of the Supreme Court acting in wholly inappropriate and lawless, unethical ways in order to distort the workings of the democratic electoral process. And I think that, that's a mark of shame and stigma that I don't think they can easily escape. They've been pursuing basically the MAGA platform. Donald Trump has been bragging all over the country about how he built the Supreme Court that overturned Roe versus Wade. And that is the same court that is also holding up the possibility of justice against Donald Trump, just in the normal workings of the criminal process. And, I suspect that the right-wing majority on the court is going to dramatically narrow one of the key criminal statutes that's been used in the prosecution of January 6th insurrectionists and rioters, and also will not eliminate, but it will definitely undermine the prosecution of Donald Trump if we ever get to it. So I guess the summary thought here is, even if the Supreme Court said, you know what, the DC Circuit got it totally right, nobody's above the law, and it would be a complete violation of the separation of powers to say that the president could escape the force of federal criminal statutes passed by Congress, could escape adjudication by the courts. Even if the court did absolutely the right thing, they've already inflicted the central damage that will, so again, change the course of history in different ways, which is why, I'm not in the adjudication business. I'm not in the prognostication business. I'm in the mobilization business. And the only force that has the power to turn things around now in America is the American people. And the vast majority of people who were with Biden in 2020, when he won by 7.5 million votes, and in this election where we have 13 or 14 million new young voters, and we should be able to dramatically increase that margin. And so that's just a question of organizing. But I do want people to see that not just as a political intervention by we the people, but a constitutional intervention by we the people to rescue our constitutional order against this sustained attack by Trump and his various accomplices and apostles.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jamie. We're gonna go to member questions in one more question. I'm gonna start off by asking a couple that we had submitted from our members online, and we'll open this up to you and then Dahlia and Joyce together on the same question. So Marianne Messina from Tennessee asks, why aren't Alito and Thomas undergoing disbarment proceedings? And Gloria Tenchelev from California asks, have these conflicts of interest never happened before? Why was this possibility never addressed? So Congressman, do you want to take that first, and then we'll go to our legal experts as well?
Well, I think the other people probably studied it more closely than I have, but yeah, I don't know. Certainly not in our lifetime. I don't think there's been a Supreme Court justice as remotely brazen as Justice Thomas in terms of his financial conflicts of interest. I mean, he really views the Supreme Court as a money-making enterprise and an opportunity to get the billionaire sugar daddies to pay for everything. And similarly with Alito, I don't know that we've had a justice as overtly partisan political. I mean, I think Scalia was probably as political and ideological as Alito and Thomas is, and some of the others have been. But he has no problem getting involved in partisan type political controversies. And, that's sort of where things were drawn the line before. It's the highest court in the land with the lowest ethical standards. There is no binding ethics code on the Supreme Court. It is each person being a judge in his or her own case, which cuts, of course, against the central principle that Madison outlined, that has been part of Western jurisprudence for as long as it's existed, which is nobody can be a judge in his or her own case, but that is exactly what operates for the Supreme Court. So we need to apply the general federal ethics code to the Supreme Court, and then figure out a way to have review, perhaps by an ethics panel of circuit court justices. We've also advanced legislation to have an inspector general at the Supreme Court, which should probably clean things up pretty quickly. But right now, it's just a complete runaway court from an ethics perspective. And the private ethical crises that have caught public imagination so much are just a mirror of the public legitimacy crisis of the Supreme Court, where the doctrine is completely collapsing to the point where, constitutional law professors don't even try to teach systemic legal doctrine under particular parts of the Constitution, because it's just utterly political in terms of what happens. And there's no way of making predictions based on reason and logic. You've got to look at the identity of the parties and, whose political axe is going to be Gordon.
Great. Dahlia or Joyce, want to jump in?
I can just say quickly, I really want to shore up one thing that Congressman Raskin just said that is so important, which is I think that there is a temptation, particularly in the press, to disaggregate the ethics story from the doctrinal story, to suggest that there's one really interesting story about salmon fishing and about, luxury RVs and loans to Clarence Thomas's grandnephew for school, and that is separate and distinct from what's happening on the docket. And I cannot urge you more strongly to resist the temptation to treat that as two different stories. They are the same stories because they are the story of the court being captured by money interests and by, a very, very small sort of fringe conservative movement that has for decades now been at work trying to capture the court to do through the court what cannot be done through the legislative bodies and through the executive branch. So the first thing I want to say is, please understand these are the same story. The other thing, just to be responsive to the question, is that I think that this is a question largely about what we thought were laws and rules that were binding were in fact norms. And that there was a norm that suggested that when Abe Fortas was caught doing something fractionally as unethical as Justice Thomas, he was asked by his colleagues on the court, and in fact by the Chief Justice, who was also a liberal, to resign. And he did, because there was such a thing as shame. So I think that just my general answer to both the questions is that things like having the Bar Association step in, things like having every lawyer in America frantic to get this resolved has not materialized because there is a norm around the court that is very small c conservative, that is sort of asleep at the switch. I want to quote Congressman Raskin back to himself. A few weeks ago, he told me at a live show, we have to fall out of love with the court and the notion that because the court gave us Brown and gave us Roe and gave us Obergefell, it's fundamentally a moderate institution. It is not a moderate institution. It had a couple good minutes in the 70s, but I think we need to be very, very clear that the court has been captured and the court is now performing the act of vote suppression in order to continue to do things through the judicial branch that it couldn't do through the other branches. And the very last thing I want to say before I turn it to Joyce is simply that we are kind of sleepwalking through a moment in which we are so enamored of this vision of an oracular, perfect court that we have, many of us, not on this call, but so many of us, missed that the court has turned into a monarchic court, a court that is unlike any Supreme Court in any other constitutional democracy in the world, including no term limits, including no ethics rules, including no checking function. And that we are about to tilt into a monarchic court, creating a monarchic executive branch if the immunity case goes the way some of us fear it will. And that we have continued to feel, I think, by and large, that the court is mostly okay with a few ethics violations. And so we need a massive, very rapid shift out of this kind of complacent notion that the court is still pretty much okay much of the time, to shift into a meaningful conversation, the one we're having here, about what's to be done about it.
Yeah, so I would add to all of that. I teach a law school seminar called Democratic Institutions, and here's the TLDR on that class. We spend a whole semester looking at different institutions. And by the end of every semester that I've taught this class, now 6 times, my students conclude that the institutions are only as strong as the people who populate them. And I think that that's the unfortunate moment that we're having with understanding what it means to have a Supreme Court. You know, we have this in large part so that we don't have the star chambers that kings use to give preferential treatment to their friends and to their allies, or to punish their enemies. And now we're learning that we need to have institutional support. And I will tell you that I started out as someone who had really deep constitutional concerns about engaging in oversight of the Supreme Court. But I have really come around on this issue, because I think that the court has in some ways perpetuated this myth that only the court can police itself. And look, the reality is that they've failed, and it's time to try something new. I'm a huge fan of the Inspector General proposal. And I will tell you that as someone who lived with inspectors general at DOJ for 25 years, I didn't always get along with the IG. I can remember a couple of very heated phone calls that I had when I didn't like the process that they were using. But when you look at it over the broad range of time, this sort of person who sure, their office is maybe in your main building, but they're charged with looking at fraud, waste, abuse, misconduct, and making sure that as an institution, you're functioning within democratic boundaries. This seems like a moment that is long overdue for this court. All we have to do is look back to the early release of the Dobbs opinion, right? Where the court was all amped up about figuring out who had done that, and then suddenly there was radio silence. I don't know about y'all, but I would really like to know what caused that radio silence to take place. I have some guesses. I bet we all do. I think as Americans, we're entitled to know. So we're at a point where these external moves are long overdue. I think we all need to support our members of Congress, like Congressman Raskin, who are proposing these measures. And we need to make sure that Americans understand that the court is on the ballot in November.
Thanks, Joyce. All right, since the Congressman's time is limited, we're going to do a couple of rapid fire questions from our members to him, then bring back in Dahlia and Joyce, and add to the mix Lauren Windsor, who got Alito on tape recently, admitting his intentions. Congressman, you can hear first from Pookie. I will leave it to others to unmute Pookie to ask.
Hello,
and good job, Lauren.
Thank you, and you're doing a great job, and I watch you live in Congress. Yes, go after them tooth and nail, because they should be ashamed for what they're doing to American people. All right, my question is, how can one Senator, Lindsey Graham, hold up the Ethics Act for the court? One man is holding up all progress. That's not a democracy.
Well, and that, that's the magic of the Senate with the filibuster rules, because they could overtake him and shut him down if they had 60 votes to do it. But you need 60 votes in order to unblock any obstacle like that. And that's what gives each senator so much veto power. They don't have a lot of power to get stuff done, but they've got, each one has the power basically to kind of pocket veto legislation because of the standoff that we've got there. You know, and it raises the larger problem that our democratic progress in America is being held up by a series of anti-democratic institutions like voter suppression, like the gerrymandering of our federal and state legislative districts, like the right-wing Supreme Court, like manipulation of the Electoral College, which is an antiquated and obsolete and undemocratic institution. And so they use all of that to basically get people frustrated with democracy, but it's not democracy that is thwarting us, it's anti-democracy. It's this bag of tricks that they have in order to prevent the very clear majority will from operating on everything from gun safety to abortion rights to public education or what have you. And so we've got a right-wing minority operating like a religious political cult, which is being able to manipulate the levers of power. And the filibuster is an important ingredient in that. And the only answer to it, at least that I can figure out, is massive political mobilization and winning every office at every level to try to turn things around and to dismantle them. I mean, but I don't want to leave you with a sense of hopelessness, because the history of progress in our country is the history of taking these barriers down, right? If you read the Constitution the way that I read it, the 17 amendments that we've had since the Bill of Rights are overwhelmingly about expanding and deepening the meaning of democracy and equality in the country, and taking down slavery and taking down Black disenfranchisement and taking down the disenfranchisement of women, taking away the indirect election of U.S. senators by state legislators and giving it directly to the people, giving people in D.C. the right to participate in presidential elections, removing the poll tax, lowering the voting age. That's the trajectory we've got to get back on. I mean, Tocqueville said in Democracy in America, he observed that democracy is either shrinking or expanding. It never just stands still, which is what's a little bit deceptive about saying we're going to defend democracy. We're not going to defend some status collection of institutions. We're going to defend forward momentum in terms of democracy. So we're going to get back on the statehood track by passing statehood for Washington, D.C., 700,000 disenfranchised, tax-paying, draftable U.S. citizens who have a valid political grievance but didn't come down in the Capitol and beat the hell out of our police officers and try to overthrow the government. They petitioned for statehood. We get 3.5 million Americans in Puerto Rico who are not represented. So we need to deal with statehood. We need to deal with a constitutional amendment on the right to vote. We've got to get away from the Electoral College, which is, strictly speaking, anti-majoritarian. It's given us 5 popular vote losers as president twice in this century, in 2000 and 2016. And it's dangerous, as we saw on January 6th. It can get you killed because there's so many nooks and crannies and, you know, off-ramps that if you've got a strategic bad faith player like Donald Trump, and we're going to have these people for a while, they will try to manipulate every one of these little crevices to try to attack the democratic result. And they're preparing for it in 2024. They're not running a real campaign the way we are, where we're out trying to organize people and build popular support. They're just trying to attack the integrity of the election and get ready for more January 6th kinds of antics and assaults. So I wish I could say there's going to be an easy solution on the filibuster. When I thought about running for Senate, I looked very closely at that question. I mean, there's not an easy solution until we can get to, 61 in the Senate. So that's what we got to be fighting for. We got to go and organize and engage the young people.
All right. With that mention of engaging people and organizing, we're going to bring in Stace Williams from New Mexico for the next question. Stace.
First of all, I'd like to thank everyone who's here today, and P Street and PCCC for putting this event on. Mr. Raskin, there's so much that citizens like me are called upon to do. My question is deceptively simple, but I don't think the answer is straightforward, and I'm very eager to hear your thoughts. In your esteemed opinion, what is the one most important thing that concerned citizens like me can do to help reform this corrupted institution that is the Supreme Court? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Stacey. I appreciate that. I think it's been the basis of this conversation, which is taking place all across the country, that we have a matrix of democracy suppression tactics that are being used against us. And the Federalist Society has been at the center of this, extreme right-wing takeover of the court and the surrounding ethics collapse of the court, as Dahlia was describing it. So, the only problem with answering the question in the abstract is that I think it depends on where you live and what you do and what kind of work you're engaged in. And because I'm certain that there are things that all of us can do in our own worlds to be fighting for, a Supreme Court that returns to at least some basic semblance of constitutional law and the rule of law. So I guess I would say is figure out, where you live, what are the critical elections you can get involved in. Read some of the really good books about the court that are out there, educate other people. So when the moment comes, we're ready to fight. I mean, I'm increasingly convinced that, we've got 9 justices on the court. That's not a constitutional number. That's been set by Congress. It's been altered 9 or 10 different times. We have 13 federal circuits. So we should really have 1 justice for each circuit. Right now, we've got 5 justices from New York City alone, 1 for each borough. You could look at it like that. And that is an extremely lopsided, imbalanced way of doing it. And this might be our opening for talking about revamping the Supreme Court so it goes back to work for the American people. I mean, there was that brief period in the Warren Court and for a little bit longer that Dahlia invoked where we were getting cases like Roe versus Wade and Brown versus Board and Smith versus Allred and Terry versus Ohio. And there was some idea that the Supreme Court was on the side of the people, but they have just, in the Berger Court, the Rehnquist Court, the Roberts Court, they've just retreated to that old baseline of class power and political white supremacy and siding with the privileged. And it's an insider's game completely. And that's what we've got to take on, and we got to educate people about that. And, it's not so much restoring the mythology and romance of the Supreme Court, but it's creating a Supreme Court that will be aligned with democratic movements, like the civilizing movements of our history. And I'm afraid I've got to excuse myself, Adam. I'm so sorry.
No, perfect. Thank you so much for joining us, Jamie. And
Bye, Congressman.
Is there
Thank
one?
you, Joyce and Dahlia. Lauren Windsor, thank you for your great work.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jamie. All right, let's bring in Lauren Windsor in a second. And then I saw some nodding heads from Dahlia and Joyce when ethics reform and some of the things that Congress could do came up. So we definitely want to bring them in for a second. First, do we have Lauren? All right. Oops. Okay. Lauren, first, welcome, and thank you for everything that you've been doing. Let me ask you a question. So, as you were talking with Samuel Alito, hearing what was coming out of his mouth, what was going through your head at that moment in terms of what you thought the American people should be taking from what he was saying to you, and how do you decide in real time what the next question out of your mouth will be, given that you only have a couple bites at the apple and you're on the clock when talking to him? Can you tell people a little bit behind the scenes what was going through your head during that?
Sure. So 2024 wasn't the first time I talked to Justice Alito. I spoke with him at the dinner in 2023. I have to say that I really did not think that I was going to be able to break through the high level of discretion that judges have, that justices certainly have. So I didn't think that I was going to be successful whatsoever, and I wasn't in 2023. But I thought in 2024, give it another go. We'll see, given that he is probably more aggrieved with the increased scrutiny on him from the media, that he might, with the right goading, with the right sort of ego stroking, be more forthcoming. So my strategy, and when you go to events like this, the guidance is, don't bring up anything about any business before the court. And ultimately, for me, I'm trying to get at is, can I get him to say something that's going to indicate being sort of in the tank for Trump? Is he going to rule in such a way to give him immunity? Can I get any sort of sense of that? But you can't just come out and say Donald Trump. You can't just come out and say Joe Biden. So how do you broach that type of conversation to get a sense of what he's thinking without mentioning the names of the people involved or the parties involved, the Democratic Party or the Republican Party? So I thought that the best way to approach it was through a moral lens, given how religious he is. I thought talking about polarization was a good stand-in for, talking about the tension between the Republican and Democratic parties, between Trump and Joe Biden. When he started telling me that there were things that fundamentally couldn't be compromised, I was pretty shocked. I mean, in my head, I just wanted to push further to see, can I get him to say more? But unfortunately, we were interrupted by another judge. As you might imagine, he is definitely a center of attention at these types of events, and I was lucky to have the amount of time that I did with him. So would he have gone further if I had had additional time? I don't know, but I was definitely trying to coax more out of him. So once you get one sort of admission in the moment, it's like, okay, well, I've gotten this. Can I push it further? Will they be more forthcoming? And unfortunately, I just didn't have the runway to do that. So.
Got it. Well, thank you for letting us peek behind the curtain.
Yeah.
Also, I do need to inform you that we are recording this conversation and we will be posting it online later. I hope that's okay with you. Okay.
Yeah. You're funny.
Okay. Joyce, two-part question for you and also for Dahlia. First, what was your reaction when you saw Lauren's video of Alito? And second, when it comes to solutions, is there anything you'd like to share with people about, what is on the table in terms of ethics reform and which parts of it are you, most passionate about?
Yeah, wow, Lauren, I just can't even imagine what was going through your mind during that conversation. And I think it's so important for people to understand the ease with which Justice Alito has this conversation with someone who he doesn't really know. I mean, there's no sense that they're guarded or they're careful about expressing these views. We've seen so much of this in his public commentary and some of the public commentary from the other justices. And what I worry about the most is that we're no longer shocked by it. I think we should be shocked. And I appreciate so much that your video brings some of that back to the forefront. Look, I'm sort of sluggishly evolving towards Supreme Court reform, and I still have concerns about increasing the size of the court. It seems to me that it's very easy for that to become a game of tit for tat that goes on. But Congressman Raskin makes the point that is compelling to me, which is that we have 9 justices from an earlier point in time when we had fewer circuits, and that there's some appropriate way to right-size the court for our modern circumstances. There's one justice who each circuit in the country goes to for emergency applications and other issues. And there really is some rationale for doing that. I'm also very intrigued by the notion of term limits for justices and this idea that no one should serve forever. And I think that that ultimately may be a really fruitful way to approach this conversation.
Dahlia?
First of all, I love Lauren's work, and I love it even more when it's directed at the court. And I just want to note, two things that are so important. One is that this is not the first time we've heard about the Supreme Court Historical Society. We know that that's become a kind of avenue for a little bit of kind of yucky pay-to-play access to the justices that has been exploited in the past. And I really, really like that Lauren lifted up, what can be said there, and the sort of presumption that the people who attend can get kind of like an unfiltered, really, I would say, pernicious language from the justices. And I would just ask people to kind of compare and contrast what Justice Alito said to Lauren and what the Chief Justice said to Lauren, just as a sort of a marker of how far we've come. I also want to really note that everything that Justice Alito said is the kind of thing he said at his speech in Rome post Dobbs. It's just that those things don't get necessarily covered. And so I'm incredibly grateful that this kind of sent that our way. I think the other thing I just want to say, and this is so important, I'm looking at the chat and people are frustrated about the Electoral College, and they're frustrated about Citizens United, and they're frustrated about a malapportioned Senate. And I just want to really, really say very explicitly that the thing that we call democracy is a thing that is full of flaws, is full of minoritarian checks that are working precisely as designed. And so when, Congressman Raskin says, there are all sorts of nooks and crannies. If you want to exploit them, you can exploit them. And among those nooks and crannies, we have a Supreme Court that was meant to be governed by at least some checking function by the other branches that has kind of pushed that away. But that was also, I think, meant to be governed by a sense of itself. And we haven't talked about this yet. As the branch of government, the only branch that has no purse, no sword, per the Federalist Papers, no power other than public legitimacy. That's it. That's what they have. And so when they choose to squander that, and then to turn around and to blame Lauren, and to blame the press, and blame the academics, and blame folks who are seeking just meaningful reform, that is not just a kind of spectacular self-own, a decision to squander the capital that they have really over 200 years garnered, where the public accepts the result of Bush v. Gore and doesn't riot on the street. It's also a decision, I think, that we have to take seriously as the court saying to us, it's your move. And that's why I just want to say what Joyce is saying, which is the need to have a meaningful conversation about all of the flaws in this so-called democracy that we have metabolized as democracy that are now being exploited. There are bills out there to fix everyone, including the Interstate Compact, including Senate reform, including filibuster reform. And the last thing I want to say, I hope this was responsive, I'm just going to pop in the chat Mike Podharzer's really amazing piece from last week that essentially says in his Substack, this system is working exactly as designed, and it is seeking to obliterate the 20th century. And so we have to start thinking about all of these reforms, these systemic reforms, not as kind of feelings ball, but as structural democratic reform that is long overdue.
Thank you. Again, optimism. Thank you. So tell you what, I'm going to ask each of you one wrap-up question, and then after that, we will do one more crescendo of thanks from everybody on the line. So the question is basically a forward-looking one. For people who are on this call who want to do something and want to be smart observers of the news going forward, what are your thoughts to them about the stakes and what regular people should be doing in the 2024 context? And around the corner the next week or so, what is one thing that you have your eye on as a court watcher that everybody else should be paying attention to. Dahlia, do you want to start with that one? And then we'll go to Lauren, then we'll go to Joyce to wrap up.
I guess I just want to say, Joyce mentioned at the very beginning about saying the quiet parts out loud. And I want to just, I know everybody on this call is familiar with Project 2025, but we have a very, very different moment right now than we had in the 2016 and the 2020 election, where we are literally being given hundreds of pages of blueprints about what will happen in the event that Donald Trump wins. And I'm just staggered at the data that shows how few people know anything at all about Project 2025. That is the roadmap. And that is, I think, a materialization of what the court has been trying to do. In other words, disassembling the administrative state, strong thumb on the scale for a very, very extreme version of religious liberty at the expense of liberty for everyone else. So there, it's all there. And I think we need to knit together Project 2025 and the message that conveys and the work of the court, which has been doing those things for several years stealthily. And so I think I just want to end by saying, first of all, thank you so much for including me. This is a really nice, if slightly dispiriting way to start the week. But I also want to say that to folks who feel like I'm just one person, there are a million lanes out there. And it's kind of our job between now and the election to find a lane and just work tirelessly. This can't be 10 minutes a day anymore. Thank you.
Love that. Find a lane. Lauren, you found a lane. What are your final thoughts going projecting 2024?
Oh, I have a couple of thoughts. First, I just want to drill this in. I try to say it in every interview that I give, but really, people need to know that what's at stake here with this election is, are we going to, continue this tradition of secular democracy in America, or are we going to be led to Christian theocracy by an extremist religious court? And I think that the more that we can put that to light, there's a lot of people who live in this country who aren't religious Christians, and do we want to embrace that worldview of Sam Alito, Clarence Thomas, and Mike Johnson? I don't think so. So I think people need to, pardon my pun, get religion real quickly about the Supreme Court, that this is definitely on the ballot. Secondly, that to further emphasize the importance of it, the court being on the ballot, is in the remarks in the tape that I had with Martha and Alito. She made a couple of comments that had indicated a time horizon of really anticipating Justice Alito's retirement in the next term. Obviously, Justice Alito, being the ideologue that he is not going to retire if Biden is in the White House. If Trump wins, they're retiring. I mean, Martha Ann's already talked about suing media companies because there's a 5-year statute of limitations, even though all the lawyers I talked to said it's actually not 5 years. I'm not a lawyer, but Joyce or Dahlia can confirm the 5-year statute of limitations mistake on her part. But that's what she was saying in the tape. She further, was talking about, when you're done with all this nonsense, referring to the Supreme Court, when Sam Alito is done with all this nonsense, indicating she anticipated it being sometime in the near future. So I would just say, if you don't want to have a more right-wing Sam Alito, who's 20 or 30 years young, probably in his 50s, I guess Sam Alito's 74 right now. So I would just say they could cement the far right-wing bent of the court for much longer if there's a Trump presidency and both Alito and Thomas resign. So just wanted to emphasize the importance on both of those counts, and to thank the other speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. And before throwing things over to Joyce, one programming note: if you want to catch more of the folks on this Zoom right now, Lauren, you can Google her at The Undercurrent and follow her channel. You can follow Dahlia at Slate, or check out her podcast, Amicus. If you're not a law student at the University of Alabama Law School, then you should watch Joyce on MSNBC or NBC. And Joyce, you're a former U.S. attorney. Closing argument. Go for it.
Yeah, so, I'm intrigued by the part of the question that asks, what can all of us do? What can each of us do? And Dahlia says that we have to find our lane. And I think that's true and that's challenging. Lots of people want to find their lane, but aren't entirely sure how to get there. So I come with ideas. Last week, the New York Times cited in a piece to a study that said that 17% of Americans believe that Joe Biden is responsible for taking away Roe versus Wade. And that is just astonishing. Those 17% of Americans and many of our fellow citizens don't really get their news from a network like the one that I'm on. They don't necessarily read Dahlia. They don't get their news from these sources. But what they will do is they will listen to their friends and their neighbors and their families. And so I think what each of us can do in this moment is educate ourselves, arm ourselves with facts and statistics, whether that's about Supreme Court reform or any other issue that you feel passionate about, and be willing to go out there and engage in civil discourse with your neighbors and with people at the grocery store counter. Don't underestimate your ability as an individual to engage in this practice of democracy. So I have really appreciated the opportunity to start my week surrounded by smart people who have motivated me to re-engage in that work. And many thanks to P Street for everything that you're doing and that all of our listeners are doing. I bet everybody here is well educated. I bet you can go out and have 5 conversations this week, even if you don't convince people, and you don't have to convince people. You can plant seeds that will let them get there on their own when the time is right.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Joyce, Dahlia, and Lauren, for your incredible work. We, in typical PCCC P Street fashion, are going to do one last hoorah for everybody here. So on the count of 3, we're going to unmute everyone, do one last cheer, and go into this last week of the term energized and ready to hold this. So on the count of 3,
she said I mailed it.
1, 2, 3.
Yay. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh,
Our worries into work.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you one last time.
all the citizens of the country.
All of our incredible panelists, Dahlia Lithwick, Joyce Vance, Lauren Windsor. Please check them out and follow them wherever they are so you can stay as up-to-date as we are. And again, thank you to, in absentia, the great Oversight Ranking Member, Congressman Jamie Raskin. With that, we're going to close today's meeting, but thank you all so much for being here, and we hope to see you very, very soon.